All right, our next speakers are Irfahn and Ken, and they're going to be talking to us about the insider threat. Please welcome Irfahn and Ken.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Ken Westin. This is Irfahn Khimji. So we're both with Tripwire, and we're going to be talking about insider threat today. And we're going to do it a little bit differently than you probably heard about it before. We're going to do a little bit of good cop, bad cop. I get to be the bad cop. And Irfan's going to be the good cop. So I have a lot of experience actually setting traps for people. I'll talk a little bit about that. And Irfan has a lot of experience actually on the defensive side and actually working with companies to set up defenses and security policies and things like that, particularly around insider threat. So we'll kind of be switching off here and there. I think it's really important to kind of look at it from both perspectives. You have to be able to understand the malicious insider, and sometimes you have to think like them and think about, especially as a privileged user, what damage could I cause to my organization? I even think about, like, what if I went rogue? What if I had to come up with a bunch of money, or
Ken,
I was compromised?
We don't want you going rogue.
All right. So yeah, so I have a background. This is what I call my wall of shame. These are actual cases I've been involved with where I've actually put people in jail. I developed a lot of different tools, sort of friendly Trojans, if you will, that would actually trick like a USB flash drive into compromising a computer, send information out about where that device is, who has it. I then also built tools for recovering stolen laptops, so utilizing the built-in web camera, getting location off Wi-Fi networks, and then other tools too that were dealing more with grabbing serial numbers off of images that are posted online. I have a bunch of recovery stories that are like that, so I have a lot of experience in sort of developing these traps, and I'll talk a little bit about that, how we can use traps like this to catch the malicious insider, and also use some of the rules for the correlation of different log formats and things like that, and how that information can be used to identify a suspicious person. So you want to take that?
So, key thing here is, in any organization, the greatest asset is also its greatest threat, right? The people, you guys. Really key here, because an organization is not going to run unless it's got good people, and good organizations always have good people. Now, what happens if those good people turn rogue? And that's really key.
So I had for another company I worked for, we actually had a case where I was managing the web servers and the systems, and I got a call around 3 o'clock in the morning, getting alerts that the web server was down. I went in to try to figure out what was going on. At the time, we had open source version of Tripwire, so I could actually go through and identify pretty quickly what had happened. We actually had an admin who was in charge. We had actually hired a contractor to go in and help with security hardening. Come to find out, there was actually a disagreement with management about him being paid. He was actually overbilling, and the management wasn't paying the full amount. So he decided he was going to show us, so he logged into the main web server and decided to bring it down. It was a really bad thing for him. We were able to provide this information to them, and the server was actually being used for law enforcement purposes. So he was actually interfering with an active investigation, which is also a felony. And the thing here, though, is that if management would have notified me or other admins that there was a problem with this particular contractor, we could have de-escalated his privileges. They weren't aware that he still had access at the time. There wasn't any sort of notification that went out to the rest of the IT staff that his work was done, or that there was this particular issue.
So, some interesting stats here, right? 38% of organizations with 1,000 or more employees have experienced one or more insider threat incidents. I'm sure that's gone up over the last couple of years. That's a couple of years old. 58% of information security incidents attributed to insider threats. Now, one of the questions we always like to ask is, what makes somebody go rogue? So I throw this question out there. Feel free to shout out an answer. I can't really see hands with the lights, but what do you think? What would make an insider go rogue? Any takers? Sorry. Sorry. Money. There you go. Okay. Money. Anything else? Evil bosses. That's a common one. Sorry. General disgruntlement. Yeah, something could have happened. So if we take a look at those stats, I mean, we got a whole bunch here. So fraud is a big one. This is from the US CERT. IP theft, espionage, IT sabotage. A couple of the key ones were, some of the recent ones that I noticed were around competitors and competition. Competition's been heating up lately. Again, this stat's, I think about a year old or so. But as competition comes up, people are trying to recruit others from their companies. And hey, if we're going to recruit you across from a competitor, bring over some information. We'll throw you an extra bonus when you log up. So money was a big one. Bosses was another one I heard out there. I don't know who that was, but don't worry, I won't tell your boss. And really, if you're not happy if you're not happy with where you work, you're going to be looking for other employment. And if a competitor wants to recruit you, they might give you a little bit of incentive to take something out along the way.
Yeah, so you guys are familiar with kill chain when it comes to hacking, but the FBI actually developed one specifically for insiders. It's a little bit different when you're dealing with an insider threat because they're not stealing credentials and doing unauthorized things. They actually have authorized credentials and they're doing unauthorized things. So the first is sort of the recruiting or the tipping point. And this is sort of where they decide that they're going to go rogue. They have that bad boss and they're going to show them they're going to damage the server, they're going to steal data, or whatever the motivation is. The next thing they're going to do is they're going to go through and they're going to be doing search and recon. They're going to identify what do I have access to, what information do I have access to through Salesforce, cloud services, or other file shares I might have access to for some of this information, or how can I escalate my privileges or get someone else to get that information for me as well. And then they move into the acquisition phase where they actually start doing the acquisition of the data, or they may actually start causing damage to the systems. And then, of course, the exfiltration of that data or damaging the server, bringing it down. And that's where we actually have the damage within the organization. And sort of through these phases, we have different ways. We have prevention, detection, and response. And it's not always a technical thing, right? We hear a lot about, particularly with HR and legal, they have to play a really key role when they're dealing with insider threats. When this comes down to recruitment, doing things like background checks, making sure that these folks, they don't have criminal records or have done anything illegal. But there's usually going to be non-technical indicators. And this also requires that these departments work very closely with IT departments. A lot of times these organizations are very siloed. IT sometimes doesn't talk to, HR doesn't talk to IT, and the legal department isn't involved. What's really interesting is if you actually have a very strict security policy that basically says you're allowed to monitor what they do on the computer, even if you're not necessarily doing it, it does have a pretty significant impact on people's behavior. It's sort of like if you put a surveillance camera, even if it's fake, people are going to behave a little bit better in that environment than they would otherwise. If they don't think they're being monitored, they're going to be a little more on the rogue side. And then, of course, we have the technical indicators, which we'll talk about a little bit more here.
So what are some indicators of human risk, right? How do I know that, from a non-technical perspective, that there could be a chance that, one of my coworkers or somebody who reports to me or even one of my bosses could be an indicator of risk or could become an insider threat? So some of the things we look at up here is are they consistently the first and last out of the office? Has this person actually had time to review or share their work? A lot of times if they're the first and last out of the office, great, they're a fantastic employee, due for a bonus, due for a raise, right? Not always. There's a lot of cases where they're just trying to have people not look at their work. Maybe they're coming early in the morning, trying to find some time where others aren't in the office yet to access some systems that they may should not be accessing. They might be staying a little bit late to close off some stuff or to set a job to run at night, to have it start up in the morning or have it run overnight and shut it off in the morning before anybody gets in there. 12 plus months without taking a vacation. How many people here like to take vacations? Anybody? Yeah, almost everybody. This guy up here, he's just does not. I'd watch out for him. But if they haven't taken a vacation in a while, have they actually shared any of their work with any of their coworkers, right? Has anybody had a chance to be backup for them? There may be somebody that's a backup on paper, but are they actually getting a chance to look at that person's work and review their work? If they're not getting a chance to do that, and they're in the office the whole time and segmented, might be a chance that they're looking at something else. Of course, these individually may not be that suspicious, but when you kind of pile things in together, they tend to add up, right? Life changes, right? Somebody shouted out earlier, just disgruntled in general, right? If something happened in their life, they could just be, hey, I got nothing to lose. I might as well steal some money or steal some sensitive information that I can sell. Things like giving notice or being laid off, right? If I give 2 weeks notice, you better start de-escalating my privileges because you don't know what I'm going to take on the way out, right? It's not necessarily private information. It could be customer data. It could be things that, hey, if I'm in sales, for example, I might want to take my customer list, so I move on to the next job, and I already have a customer list. I don't have to start from scratch. That's things that happen in that 2 weeks notice. So a lot of these types of things to take a look for. So how do we detect and prevent some of these things, right? So we look at background checks. We look at the threat modeling. We look at periodic security awareness training. You know, a lot of individuals may take information with them unknowingly. They might not know that it's against company policy. They might not know it's illegal. Awareness has really been key, and we heard a lot about that yesterday from some of the other talks. And it's really getting that awareness out there and getting people to know that, hey, this stuff's against policy. You know, periodic or monitoring for suspicious behavior. Again, that goes into more technical things, which we'll get into, as well as, you know, establishing clear lines of communication. You may have a disgruntled employee. An employee may not be happy with their boss, but they might like their boss's boss. They're one up. And having those clear lines of communications where you can actually talk about these things and build a better working environment really helps to deter people from going rogue.
Yeah, so now we're going to get more into the technical side. So indicators of risk when it comes to humans to machines. So as people interact with devices on the network, you know, you can see things like an increasing number of logins, variation of remote versus local. And we'll talk about some correlation rules for this in our log intelligence or our SIM tools. But these are things that you can start to monitor for. You should have this hooked into Active Directory so you're able to get some of this information. You start to see that they're logging into a network at odd times, sometimes at midnight or 2 o'clock. And that may not be an indicator that they're a rogue employee, but it could be something that someone else is using their credentials as well. So those are things we want to watch for. Logging in frequently during vacation times. Again, that might be an indicator that someone else has their credentials and is using it. Not necessarily that they're actually logging in on their vacation, but someone else may have access to their logins. Remote logging, yeah. So changes in websites visited at work versus personal. You start to see that they're using LinkedIn a little bit more often. Maybe spend a lot more time on Facebook. Usually, you know, you don't want to go and invade their privacy, but you start to see that they're on that for 4 hours a day. That could be an indicator as well that there might be a problem. Yeah, you see an increase in printer usage. You know, it's still a very easy way to exfiltrate data. A lot of times, organizations still don't monitor what's being printed, and they should. You're going to see export of large reports or downloads from internal systems or external. How many people in your organization are using Salesforce? How many of you actually have audit logs of what your salespeople are downloading? Right. So there's actually something you can do. There are logs that you can go in. You can get access to some of that information. Not necessarily that large reports are being created, but you can access and get some. It's in a CSV file format, and you can put that into your SIM or your log intelligence tool as well. Just something to consider. Also, if you see a large file share that's actually being created somewhere on a server or on a computer, that might be another indicator that someone is downloading that information from somewhere they shouldn't. You also start to see new patterns of physical access. If someone's using their key card to get into a server room or to go in a different part of the building that they usually wouldn't be, that's another thing that we want to monitor. So when we want to talk about detect and prevent, we want to implement strong password and account policies. We want to enforce separation of duties, least privilege, and data classification. These are things that we should be doing anyway, of course, but this also applies to insider threat as well. So we want to do extra caution with systems administrators and technical or privileged users. I think this is one of the biggest things. You know, using DLP services or tools are great for dealing with, you know, your sales people or people doing regular business activities. But when you're talking about privileged users in particular, there needs to be additional reporting, additional logging that goes into all their activities as well. Or using temporary passwords, things like that is a good idea as well. You want to implement system change controls and approve process. You want to deactivate computer access following termination. We'll even show you some examples here of actual companies where this was a major issue. Not only in deactivating those accounts, but also monitoring what other accounts did that administrator create. So maybe you deactivated their account, but they had created 5 other admin accounts that you didn't know about. And so they're going to be able to use those to get into the system. And then, of course, we want to log, monitor, and audit employee network activities. So what do we want to log and monitor? I get this asked a lot. The first things, if you're just getting started with logging, make sure you have firewalls, unsuccessful login attempts. That's a really good one for Insider. Unauthorized changes to systems. So if you're looking at like file integrity monitoring or security configuration monitoring as well, monitor any sort of configuration file changes. Antivirus alerts, physical access. So we'll talk a little bit about that in some examples. A lot of people don't realize that the HID devices that have the RFID chips, they actually generate logs. A large majority of them do, and that's actually something good that you can bring into your SIM to monitor, where someone actually is within the building. It helps with evidence if you have to actually put them in front of a computer, for example, physically. And then intrusion detection systems, of course, and then your web proxy logs. Oh, I got a lot here. So, when we look at log data in particular, you can call it machine data, but it's really important that you realize just how rich that information is. A lot of times when this information is out there, it's we store it on the systems or we archive it, but we don't actually make use of it. Is there an animation that builds out? So we want to look at how the information gets correlated, and then you want to be able to create dashboards from that as well. So we talked, a little bit about threat models. When we talk about insider threat, we want to identify what are the possible ways that they would go in and actually, access confidential information. What would be the steps, and what would be the tripwires that would indicate that they're actually up to something? So we want to be able to take all this log data, and we want to create what's called actionable intelligence, information that we can actually use. It can either be through alerts. It can actually activate scripts. If you see that someone is trying to access a server they shouldn't, maybe fire off an email saying, hey, you've just been tagged here, just to let you know that's a warning. Or you can even automate some other things as well. And then also integrations with other systems. So if you have a SIM or if you have some sort of HR system as well, you can do an integration here as well. And then you want to get into analytics, forensics, and compliance. And that's not necessarily so much in real time, but being able to have an archive of all of your log data, all that activity that happened on that network. It's really helpful if you have to terminate someone. This is where we start getting into the legal aspects, right? If you terminate someone for doing something like this, you better have the log data to back that up. There can be potential lawsuits, or if it does turn into a criminal case, you're going to need that information. I talk a lot with the FBI, and one of the things that they always come in, the first thing they ask for when there is an incident is what? Where are your logs? That's the first thing they usually ask for when there's been an incident. And a lot of times they don't have it. I've seen a lot of companies, they don't even have basic log collection. And that's a real challenge when they're dealing with insider threats or any sort of security issue in general.
Yeah, just to add to that, a lot of things we're seeing lately with various vendors and within the security community is that a lot of these tools that you guys use on a day-to-day basis now integrate with each other or are working towards integration. So if you haven't already looked at how some of your tools can work together, it's a great idea to go back to your vendors and say, hey, what are you doing to integrate with the rest of my security ecosystem? How can I automate a lot of things that I have to do manually? Instead of me having to take this alert and go over here to this next system and look up something else, how can I just have that automated? Vendor community is trying to get better at it, so it'd be great if you go back to them and say, hey, these are the things that we'd like to see. So, interesting case study we had not too long ago. Without getting too specific, so it was a power company in the US. So there's plenty of those, so hopefully that doesn't narrow it down too far. There was a system administrator who was terminated. And obviously, if you get fired, I wouldn't be very happy if I got fired. I don't know many of you who will. Anybody would be happy if they got fired? No? The guy who didn't like his boss. Yeah, okay. So, of course, didn't have a good process, didn't have a good procedure, didn't have anything going on at that company, so they left their credentials, they left that guy's credentials in there. How do you know that he shouldn't be accessing that, right? So, what did he do? Middle of the night, logged in, logged on, to, disabled logging on a firewall, and that's kind of things that we found. So how did we find that, right? If he's logging in at an odd time, you can create a log in your SIM. Like, how would you find that, rather? Was there a successful log on after hours? So basically, if you've got a log collection tool, right? If you're seeing something that, somebody logging in at an odd time, you can create just a simple rule that says, hey, if I'm logging in outside of regular business hours, right? something sketchy in there. Unless, of course, there's a change window and things like that. But that's typically something I want to be looking at. Second piece in there is, was there a successful logon to a high-value asset from an unauthorized system? So yes, okay, it might have been within a change window that this person was accessing the system, but if it's from outside of our network or somewhere that shouldn't be logging in from, this is something else that we can fire off. So these are just two simple rules you can create in your login sim to be able to detect unauthorized access from somebody who was fired. Of course, better practice really is to disable their account so they can't get in. But in the event somebody forgets, here's a way to pick it up.
So another fun thing to do, just to experiment with, is doing insider honeypots. So utilizing these tools, it can provide you some indicators of maybe people who are poking around the network in the systems. It's also good for if a hacker does get in, for example. This can also be a defense for that as well, gathering some additional intelligence around their intentions. One thing to note is IDS systems, they should not only be deployed on your perimeter, but also inside the network. A lot of times people will think, we're just going to use this to protect the perimeter, but actually IDS systems like Snort or Bro, they're really powerful when you're using them within your network.
So how many people actually use IDSs inside their network as well? Any? Two,
quite
three,
a few.
small handful?
Anyone in particular, like Snort or Bro or Snort? So it's so this is kind of what an alert looks like if someone's actually running Nmap against Snort. If they're not quite sure what they're doing, if they're running an initial scan, this is what it would look like. And this is something you want to ask. If someone in marketing downloads Nmap and starts scanning your network, you want to be able to have some observation as to why they're doing that, and be able to provide those reports. Next. So this was just something fun I did with Irfahn here. So you can actually create these honey document files. There used to be a site called Honey Files or Honey Docs or something like that. It's no longer active, but you can kind of create your own.
Last time I bought you a flight to a conference.
Yeah, well, I just sent this to Irfahn. I'm like, hey, can you open this up and see if it works? And
These are not real credit card numbers, so those of you taking pictures.
Except for Irfan's, that's real. Okay. So you can throw an image bug here. So if you look down here, I have a web server. And then, for example, I just want to name this campaign Irfahn Khimji Honey Doc. And then I save that as just a .doc file. And then you can put it on a file share somewhere on the network. And then if you go to the next slide.
Sorry, just simple thing like this. It didn't even pick up on anything. I opened up on my laptop. No antivirus, no nothing. Didn't pick up anything at all.
So yeah, so here's what it looked like. I have one for credit, executive salaries, nuclear launch codes, whatever someone that that is a malicious insider that maybe they won't have access to. Salaries is always a good one. But then here's what the log files on my server look like. When he pinged this, I was able to get a few of them, and it worked pretty quickly and seamlessly. And I'm able to get the IP address. And maybe it's an internal IP, but I can also, if he's at home and he's connecting, I can correlate that with VPN logs, and I identify like the employee's home IP address as well, and see that this was actually open from their home network. Next.
So, the second case study we had, now that he successfully exploited me, was a tire company. So this was a large U.S. tire retailer, again, not naming names. And what happened was an employee created a backdoor for remote access. So hey, it takes too long to VPN and Citrix and I don't know what you have to do nowadays to work from home. Why don't I just create a backdoor? Well, again, the employee was terminated, but the backdoor was never closed. So, a couple of days later, I'm pretty disgruntled. I got fired from my job. Let me try to log in and see if my backdoor is still there, because my VPN may have been disabled, but my backdoor is still open. Fantastic. So now I can try to siphon information out of the organization. So again, simple log rule to be able to detect that is, was there a successful logon to a high value asset from somewhere that shouldn't be there, right? Very simple rule that you can create in your login sim. And then of course, an example, because that unfortunately didn't go detected, but in the event we were to detect something like this, I created sort of a demo of how you can. So we have a file here that we got a user to download. It was how to get a huge raise.pdf.exe. So, if I want to get a huge raise, I got to open the PDF, right? But it's not a PDF. And what that did is open up a new firewall rule. So just a quick difference in terms of what the firewall looked like before and after. So over here, we noticed we had a new rule that came in called Open Sesame, opening port 1337 with my file, how to get a huge raise.pdf.exe. So now all of a sudden, I've got my backdoor open. And here you can see just before and after that now we're listening on that port.
Good. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about physical access and actually talk about a case study. Let's build it out here. So I had built a tool a long time ago that basically was called USB Hacks. I was really interested in USB-based Trojans, and actually turned it into a product. We actually had a guy who had a flash drive stolen, and it had this agent that was installed on his drive. And so it was 32 gigabyte flash drive. He was a college professor, had a bunch of research on it, so he really wanted to get that back. And we were able to see that it connected from a particular university in a computer lab, but that wasn't enough information really for law enforcement. IP address, if you guys want to talk about attribution, IP address is not enough to put someone in front of the computer, which is a big challenge. So we needed more information. And I was talking to the campus security, and they found that, well, actually they require a student ID card. I'm like, okay, well, there's log data there, right? Yeah, and then, oh yeah, come to find out, they also had a bunch of computers that were stolen out of that lab about a year ago, so they actually installed security cameras. And what I found too is that those also generate log files. So if you look at sort of non-traditional approaches to identifying physical access, so if you look at student ID, card swipes, RFIDs, those all generate log files, as well as any sort of video surveillance. Those also generate log files, and you can bring those into a SIM or your log intelligence tool and correlate that as well. So here's what looks like in our log product, where we actually bring in some of these HIDs. We're able to see the name of the person, and then we also have this tied into Active Directory. So it's really nice being able to follow people physically around the building, as well as virtually when they're logged into the network. Good. So some sample log detection rules that can be created. Log on attempt from a terminated employee or contractor. Odd remote login patterns from the employees on a watch list. If you have that communication with HR, they can either add names to that watch list or work with IT to add those names. Again, you start seeing logons from employees at weird times. High value assets from unauthorized systems. Creation and deletion of a user within a certain interval. Add and delete user. So these are all just some examples of various rules that you can create and correlate them with other systems. Go on to the next one. So here we're going to do an example. So let's say we have an employee whose behavior looks a little suspicious. Let's monitor and see if he's connecting to organizations outside. CERT actually did a bunch of sort of attack vectors, and they found that this was a very common one, where someone would actually SSH into a remote server and they would upload information. If you're going to steal data, that's probably the easiest way. So what we're going to do is we're going to set rules to watch and alert on connections from outgoing ports after hours, and we're going to look at these particular ports. So if we can go ahead and go to the next slide there. Sorry, it's kind of tiny, but this is it's in Ceph format, which is a common expression format, so this can actually be imported into most log intelligence or SIM tools. ArcSight, Splunk, they all will support this. But here you have a suspicious connection by risky employee. That's going to be the name and the alert that will get fired off. You can establish your time ranges, and then the name of the user, the IP address, and other information. Then we want to identify and monitor any sort of ports here. So this is good for the technical guys, but then what about HR, right? How are they going to be able to identify this? You can easily create dashboards so they don't have to mess with the technical aspects of it. So here's a dashboard that we created for HR. I talked about the HR watch list. Well, this is tied into Active Directory, so we can easily watch those particular users and watch their behavior, and also look for anything else that's suspicious. So any of those correlation rules that we talked about earlier for the malicious insider, those can be easily brought into a dashboard here. So if you're using like our product, our log product, or you're using Splunk or ArcSight, all this is possible.
So really, just to kind of tie that all together, is you really got to look at your logs. A lot of the data breach reports and all these things that come out, they say, well, hey, you could have detected this if you were monitoring your logs. Well, that's fantastic, but what are some of the challenges that we have, right? There's a lot of volume. There's a lot of logs. If you're logging everything, you're logging everything. There's a lot to look at there. So really, how do you know? You have to be able to identify certain rules and certain criteria to take those lots of logs and really look at the things that are important. So really determining what you have and what you're going to do with it. Policies and procedures, right? You got to make sure you have legal consult for this, because if you're monitoring everything and logging everything for your staff at all times, you got to make sure there's legal contracts and things like that in place, and you consult your legal department. False positives are always a big problem, right? If you're creating all these rules and you have all these things blocking automatically or detecting and sending emails, you don't want to get flooded with 1,000 emails or a bunch of calls at 4 in the morning. So you got to make sure that you tune and you work to identify and streamline all these logs to things that are important. And then establish a baseline, right? So what is normal? And everybody's normal is a little bit different. Right, every organization is going to be a little bit different than the next organization. So there's no real out of the box that works out of the box. It's going to require some tuning, and it's going to require some work. So you got to be willing to put in that work so you're able to tune and remove those. And then accessing the information, right? So who needs it? So like Ken was talking about just now, the technical folks are going to need their technical stuff. HR is going to need to see HR things. Compliance for people are going to need to see compliance stuff. So really being able to access the information and provide the appropriate reports to the appropriate people is really key. And being able to identify that, so you're not just throwing information at people, but you're working with them to tune them and get the appropriate information that they need. So once you get all those logs, well, we need to respond to them. So you need to be able to automate and action these things that happen. So if you were to detect an insider threat or any other threat, you need to be able to take the appropriate actions. If something gets compromised, you need to have secure backup and recovery. You need to be able to quickly audit a user's behavior for forensic purposes to see where they went. Did they only look at this one server or this one firewall, or were they spread out across the network? You need to be able to identify that. And then develop an insider incident response plan. So in the event we see such and such happen, we see Joe or Jack or Paul or whoever infiltrating our systems or something like that, you need to have a response plan in place. And it's not just the IT team, it's not just the business team, it requires several people throughout the company to be able to do that. So to sum it all up, right, the insider threat kill chain is going to be a little bit different than your average breach or your average hacker, because it's coming from the inside. There are human indicators and machine indicators of insider threats. There is instrument and gain telemetry of indicators. And you want to ensure that you have rapid response and recovery plans in place. Anything else you want to add?
Oh, I think that's it.
All right. So if you guys want to reach out to us, we're pretty easy to get a hold of. And if anybody has any questions, please go ahead. Yeah, so in this case, the examples that we pulled is not necessarily around DLP, and most organizations I've seen, unfortunately, don't have DLP in place. It's usually an added bonus if they do. Majority of organizations have things like vulnerability solutions. They've got log and SIM is usually the first thing that anybody does in a security program. So just being able to use existing tools is really where the focus is. The other thing with DLP is that if you're siphoning out information, a lot of times if it's an authorized user of that tool, they'll be able to get past that. So this is just looking at different ways of doing it. And of course DLP does work as well in that case. Any other questions? All right.
Thanks.
Great, thank you everybody.